communion. Amen. Please be seated. Sometime in the late 1980s, I don't remember which years, my grandmother, after teaching 6th grade for what is by her count approximately 100,000 years, decided that she needed a little change of pace. She had been doing things like teaching vacation Bible school, and then by degrees, Grandma became more adventurous. For a few years, she would take one of those little mud skipper planes up into the Northwest Territories in Canada and teach vacation Bible school up there in the summers. This resulted in my sister and I receiving lots of interesting gifts made out of moose tuft art. But then later on, she got it in her mind that she wanted to go someplace a little more far-reaching, even than the Northwest Territories. And so she became involved with an organization called ELIC, English Language Institute in China. This was the late 1980s, and going to China meant something very different back then. If you had ever met my grandmother, you would be surprised to learn that she had decided to do this. Because the ELIC was actually secretly a Christian missionary organization. And teachers, educators, would train to teach English to other educators in China in a 3-month-long summer program. Grandma loved it. She, after teaching 6th graders, those of you who work with 6th graders know that they're not always as grateful as one might hope for our efforts to bring them up into the fullness of their minds in adulthood. She loved working with these other adults who were eager to learn, excited to know more. And I think, if I'm being honest, that Grandma liked the hint of danger that was involved. The Chinese government would not be too excited about American missionaries come under the cover of one organization and using lessons from the Bible and stories about God's love as a way of teaching English to teachers in the university and the upper school level. Grandma loved everything about it. She loved the people, she loved going to different places, she loved the markets, she loved everything except for one thing, and that is the food. For all the ways in which Nelda is an adventuresome person, she is not an adventuresome culinary person. One time, I invited her and Grandpa over to lunch in which I served a kale salad, and I watched her pick at it uncomfortably and then shove it under the rest of her chicken. So you can imagine in mainland China that there were a few rules about how to get along when you were eating. The first rule is when you see something you don't recognize on the table, by all means, do not ask what it is. The second rule is that you should never, ever go in the kitchen, ever, and see what's being prepared. And the third rule is like unto the first two. If you should happen to ask, or if you should happen to go in the kitchen, you should never, ever tell any of the other English language teachers what it is that you've seen. Even when adventure is involved, it is so hard to be a guest. It's uncomfortable and disorienting. You're not in the place of your strength, but in a place of vulnerability. When I was home a couple of weeks ago, I was a guest in the homes of my family members, my brothers and sister and my mother, and it was always deciding which teenager got kicked out of their room so I could sleep in their room for the night. The soft smell of teenage perfume wafting in the air while they complained about sleeping on the couch. You have to learn as a guest how to slot into somebody else's life, how to make yourself fit into the pattern of their existence, how to figure out their rules and their ways of living. You drive their cars, so you pick them up and drop them off at work every day. You're trying to make yourself seem like you could fit in. It's a hard thing to be a guest. For most of our Bible, we have lots and lots and lots of rules about what it means to be a good host. We have the story of Abraham entertaining angels unawares, and that his hospitality is integral, is essential to how he worships God. We have all kinds of stories about what it means to be a good host, but they seem almost repetitive. For those of us who have been to the Middle East, if we've been to the Levant, if we've been to Israel, we know that hospitality is deeply baked into the DNA of what it means to be from that culture. So it's interesting to me that Jesus spent some time in our gospel today talking about what it means to be a guest. What it means to be a stranger in a strange land doing the work that you have to do. Over these coming weeks, we will be looking more and more. All of our gospel lections will be coming from the Gospel of Luke. And one of the qualities of Luke is that Jesus takes whatever the norm is, whatever is the cultural expectation, and turns it on its head. So we should not be surprised when Jesus takes the language and the method of hospitality, which is be a good host, here are the ways, and says, this is how to be a guest. Now, I think Jesus had some personal experience with what it meant to be a good guest. We often imagine that Jesus and his, what we would say, stepfather, was a carpenter. That's the language, that's the translation we often get. And when I hear the word carpenter, I think of somebody who has trained under a master, is licensed, bonded, and insured, and has their own studio somewhere where they're doing wonderful artisanal work. We have kind of a middle-class artisan version of carpenter sometimes in our minds. Lots and lots of medieval art depict Joseph that way, as someone where people would come to him with jobs that they had. But I think that the truth is something like the reverse. The Greek word in the New Testament for what Joseph did and what Jesus did was not carpenter, but tekton. Tekton was a skilled laborer. Someone who would not just stay inside of their shop waiting for people to come, but rather a skilled laborer who would go out into the world looking for work, looking for economic opportunities. Jesus was a skilled laborer. It doesn't say in the Bible where he really honed his skill, but if you go to the Middle East, if you go to Israel, you can see from the hills of Nazareth, where Jesus would have been born and raised, where he would have learned all the things that he'd learned. He and his father probably went down to the seaside town of Sepphoris, which is an international city. Lots of people coming and going, people that spoke multiple languages, people that had different commitments. Romans would be there, and people from other Greek towns, as well as practicing Israelites, as well as the Jews. It's the kind of place, those of you who have lived in cities know, you end up picking up little bits of this and that just by the very air that you breathe. So I think that rather than Jesus being in a place where people came to him, he was always in a culture and in a profession where he would go out to them. In other words, he's kind of a day laborer, a skilled laborer for sure. But he was an economic migrant for most of his life. I think he knew a lot about what that life would be. It makes me think of that line from Hamilton, where Hamilton says to another guy, immigrants, we get the job done. I think he knew what that meant, because he was always the one getting the job done out in the world. So it's interesting to me that as he's sending out 70 of his disciples in pairs, because it's always a good idea to go with a buddy, never go alone, that he shows some restraint and suggests some very specific ways about how we should go out into the world. It's interesting because if we recall last week's gospel reading, where the disciples are sent out, James and John came back and said, hey, those people over in Samaria, they rejected us. Should we smite them with a cloud of fire? And Jesus, as usual, suggests a step-down method. Go and bring them peace, and if they accept your peace, it'll be great. And if not, just do what Taylor Swift tells us to do and shake it off. Thinking about Jesus going from place to place and looking for jobs reminded me of my own ancestor, Jakob Rupp. He was an economic migrant. He came from Switzerland. And he eventually settled in the hard prairies of eastern Washington, where he and his brother established a wheat farm. a fun story is that of course they were Calvinists, because of course they were 19th century Swiss people. And the Calvinist circuit rider, who himself was not sitting in his church somewhere, but going out from farm to farm, dealing with his congregation, said, hey, yeah, I know two nice Swiss ladies that live down the county a little bit. And that Jacob and his brother rode over one Sunday to meet them and rode home, and they rode over the second Sunday and married them and brought them back. Go out in pairs. I thought about Jacob a couple of summers ago when my aunt came, and together we had the complete New York tourist experience, which is the only reason to have people come and visit you in New York, is so you can be the tourist you always wanted to be. We went to Ellis Island, which was fabulous. We went on the complete tour and saw all the places where human beings were processed, not unlike cattle. It was difficult to imagine in so many ways. They also have this really extensive internet database where you can look for your own ancestor and see if there's a record of them coming in. It was so exciting. We came prepared. We spent a lot of time looking for Jacob's data, but we could just never quite figure out if it was this one or that one. It's hard to know. We think that what he may have done is either come in through Ellis Island or gone up to Canada and taken the train to Washington. But either way, he didn't speak English. He spoke German and maybe some French. He was a guest. It was a hard life. And if Jacob came through Ellis Island or if he didn't, lots and lots of other people did. On the same day that we went to Ellis Island, we also did the little Statue of Liberty ferry tour, you know, where you go around, and there she is, and she is big. She's 108 feet tall. And you really lose sight of how big that is from a distance, but when you're standing right next to her, my goodness, what a project. Lots and lots of people saw her. Lots of people saw her, including the poet Emma Lazarus. She was asked to write this poem for the commissioning of the statue. They're still trying to, you know how it is when you're in the middle of a major capital campaign and you're just forever having more fundraisers to try and get the thing finished. So she was asked to write this poem for another fundraiser to get this Statue of Liberty finished. This French statue by Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi, titled Liberty Enlightening the World. That was the title of his statue. Now, Lazarus herself, she was a Jewish American from a pretty prosperous family on the upper Manhattan, which in those days would have been like 14th Street. And she wrote the poem in the form of an Italian sonnet, comparing this French-made statue to the Greek figure of Colossus of Rhodes, which was a 108-foot depiction of the sun god Helios celebrating Rhodes' military victory over Cyprus. Medieval artists imagined that the statue, which was destroyed sometime in the 1st century BC, stood astride between two rocks. If you watch Game of Thrones, it was like the big guy in Bravos. Just stood astride these two rocks, looking like a big military champion. But Lazarus, she had kind of a different idea in mind. When she wrote her poem, she called it the new Colossus. Because like any good poet, she was thinking about her own life and her own experience. She was thinking about the European immigrants who were pouring en masse into America in the late 1880s and the early 1900s. Lazarus, who used kind of her position of privilege to volunteer, went down and helped the Russian Jews who were coming into the Lower East Side, moving her way through the throngs of Italians and Greeks who were also pouring into that neighborhood. Speaking of the immigration tour of New York, if you haven't been to the Tenement Museum to get the full experience, I highly recommend it to you. It is worth the trip, and they are wonderful. You get to see what it was like to live, 15 apart in a small apartment that could barely be described as a one-bedroom. It was extraordinarily difficult. And so there she is, down in the Lower East Side, helping out people escaping from the pogroms of Tsarist Russia. So when she was commissioned to write this poem for the fundraiser, She took her own experience and she mapped it onto this not yet finished work of art, this 108-foot work of art. And she thought about the experiences of her fellow Jews as well as all those Italians and those Greeks who thronged the streets, and this is what she wrote. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed, sun-set gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand blows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands with your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. I thought about that poem as I enjoyed the 4th of July this last week. Woodbury style, the best style there is to enjoy the 4th as far as I can tell. I enjoyed it in ways that my own ancestors, from my great-great-great-grandfather Jacob to my great-grandmother, who was a chambermaid married to a hard alcoholic Scandinavian, I celebrated in ways they could never even dream of. Sat in my yard, drank some wine, ate some barbecue, listened to music, had great conversations with friends. Later in the evening, a friend rowed me out into the middle of Lake Quassapag so I could feel what it was like to be underneath something beautiful that was exploding and feel completely safe in the experience. It was amazing. I thought, man, if Jacob could see this. I thought, too, about economic and political migrants stuck in concentration camps in Clint, Texas. Families who sought asylum from one kind of a hell, their own kind of pogrom, and ended up in a different one. I thought about what a gift it is to live in the kind of free society that we have. It's a society that Jesus in his earthly life could never dream of. To be able to say and do and move in the ways that we do, that was never going to happen under empire. I thought about Paul's words, to bear one another's burdens. And I thought about the gospel reading again. I thought about how Jesus sends the 70 like lambs into the land of wolves. And I thought about what he said, about how he watched Satan's fall from heaven, the way Christopher so beautifully illustrated for us with music as I came back up from the gospel reading. It reminded me that systems of evil are so pervasive, they're so strong, that they have a way of even taking an angel and turning them into the devil themselves. And yet, we're gospel people. We're good news people. We're people of grace. As the old hymn says, and oh, the wrong seems oh so strong, God's love is stronger yet. Not all of us are going to be called like the 70 to go out into pairs into the world, lambs into the land of wolves. Although, like Nelda, you may be surprised at what you end up doing in your life. But all of us are called to entreat guests as if they were Jesus himself. All of us are called to be the kind of people that notice the patterns of others, that allow ourselves to be more vulnerable so that we can experience what it is to be in someone else's life, to walk in their shoes. All of us are called to bear the burdens of one another and to do everything we can to share peace. But to remember that true power does not reside in men or women. But the true power, the Christ power, resides in God. That's a lot to celebrate. In the name of God. Amen.
Amen.